Good evening, everyone. It is July 30th, 2023. This video is going to be both a monthly and weekly recap, as well as the weekly outlook for next week. Now, coming into this month, what do we have? Well, if we take a look at this, if we look at the all-time high down to kind of this pre-breakout balance on both tickers here, if we look at that, we can see these February and March highs and April highs coming in from 2022. That's roughly where we're churning currently, around that 4,600 number on the ES. The NQ, on the other hand, has gotten well above there and is now trading pretty close to its open from 2022, right at, I think it's 16, I think that's that number, 16,383. So overall, the NQ has done a really great job of making up the heavy, heavy losses from 2022. And with that said, though, week to week, day to day, the NQ has been weaker than the ES for now. And I'll get into that for a little bit later, but I want to have that in the back of your head. Uh, let's get into what we had this past month on the ES. Well, to the downside, we barely got below the first standard deviation of last month's VWAP in that first week or two of July, and instead we got bid off of the last month's POC. I think we even bid up a point above it. We ended up gapping up above these highs over here, and then on the back test we left that gap unfilled. We held the prior month's high instead, and we just kept on moving up. We ended up moving up to the third standard deviation of last month's VWAP. That was roughly around 34, I believe, or 31, something like that. And that's where we sold off on that Thursday. Overall, getting a high of the month above this March high on the RTH. So breaking that high of the month, doing a really great job pushing that third standard deviation of last month's VWAP. Overall, just a very uptrendy market, to no surprise to anyone who was day trading this thing. The Nasdaq, like I said, weaker than the ES. Yes, it did hold a similar spot in regards to its prior month's numbers. Yes, it did push to its prior month's third standard deviation of VWAP. However, after that, after we got that high on July 19th, we did not make a new high of the year, whereas the ES, as you can see, was pushing all the way to the end. Uh, so the Nasdaq just being a little bit weaker. Uh, the sell-off was unable to crack the prior month's high at that 475-ish number. I think we came about 5 points within it. However, we did not get any new highs of the year after that, unlike the ES. Now, let's get into an even smaller time frame. Let's get into the week to week now that we've got the monthly recapped. Uh, it, one second here. I just want to talk about what I'm looking for this month. July tends to be our most bullish month of the year. Now, it got thrown off a bit because we broke out of this huge balance back in June. So June ended up being our most bullish month of the year. July by no means was bearish, moved straight up and held the highs so far. August tends to be a pretty neutral to negative month for the S&P. So with that said, what am I looking for? Well, I'm kind of looking at something like this, 46, I don't know, call it 65, down to about 44, 65. This is what I think we're going to end up playing around in this month. I don't think we're going to get any sort of significant continuation of the upside. I don't think you're going to get any sort of significant move to the downside. I think it's going to be just kind of this bullish churn where it's better to buy dips than sell rips. And with that said, after that in September, I think that's when you get in line with the historic probabilities. That's when you get your sell-off. You close that contract gapped at 43.03s, and then from there you get your end of the year move up in that Q4 move up to whatever. Let's call it at least 47.36, maybe the all-time high. So that's overall what I'm looking at. The NQ is a little bit weaker than the ES on this day-to-day time frame. The RTY instead has been pushing the ES, has been helping us up. So that's what I'm looking for on these high time frames. Now, getting into something more realistic, let's now drop down to the weekly view. This is going to be a long video. We're already at 5 minutes. Sunday, we were unable to sell off. Unable to sell off at all. We held kind of the close. Monday, we had some trouble breaking 45.95. Again, had some trouble on Tuesday. Eventually broke that out. But again, no new high of the year this day. Instead, we sold off. FOMC occurred. FOMC unable to break those 45.70s or even the low of the week. Eventually, we got this gap up from the overnight bid, gap up to that prior month's third standard deviation of VWAP, and then we had a nice liquidation session. And what the shorts really wanted to see was a break of 45.50s. Instead, this thing reclaimed 45.60s in the close. You got your end of month bid up back towards the highs of balance. Nasdaq, not too dissimilar, but definitely weaker, no doubt about it. Uh, the Nasdaq on Friday closed down at the lows. Monday ended up being a look below and fail of that last week's low. And then the rest of this was just a story about this thing failing, this kind of 680 to 740 zone. Uh, Once, twice, three times, a bunch of times. It just kept failing this balance number, and it kept staying bid right at last week's low, the week prior's low, around that 522 number. Uh, Eventually, we were able to move up. We got that gap up from that Wednesday night bid into Thursday. However, we were unable to close the RTH gap going up to 911, and instead we liquidated down to the prior week's low. And then Friday you had the end of month move, and the RTH, this is the external trading hours now, that made a new high. But the RTH unable to make a new high in the week. And again, leaving these highs of the year untagged. So that's kind of how we're coming into this week, where the Nasdaq has repeatedly stayed bid off of its prior week lows, where the S&P did a really great job holding liquidation lows. So moving into next week, what am I looking for? Well, I mentioned on these high time frames, I don't think we get much above that 46.50-ish, 60-ish area. So I think we've kind of got a high of the quarter somewhere around here. Let's call it 4600 to 4660. Somewhere around here, I think the high of the quarter is in. Down below, if we hold 4680s, the last month's point of control, get back above 25, where we liquidated off of on Thursday, I think we take out this high of the year and we get into this target. However, to the downside, if we lose these lows, this liquidation low, if we lose it, I think you end up with a mini liquidation scenario where you can come down to the negative third standard deviation of last week's VWAP, and you can likely catch a bid and move back up. 45.26.5, just finding that on my chart. Yeah, roughly not last week's third standard deviation, the week before that. I think you would be able to regain that weekly low at 45.36. What is that? 36 quarter. Maybe I should slide this up a couple ticks. Move back into that weekly low, make our way back upwards. You're all good. You're back inside this pivot. You're back inside this big balance. Everything's good. Below, you'd want to see a balance, a bid at this big high time frame balance, this number, this balance I'm talking about. I don't think you're going to get a move beyond there. I think you're asking for a large move in 1 week. If you do, you'd be wanting to see this hold below there. Same old scenario I've been talking about. 8.5 minutes in. One little part left. Let's go for it. The Nasdaq, currently at the second standard deviation of last week's VWAP, failing. This to here is my main. If this clears, if we're able to hold this pivot, this major balance here, this is also where the VWAP close was, I believe, and last week's halfback, right around there, and obviously our primary resistance from about Friday. Here, 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 here. If we are able to hold this, close that gap at 911, get beyond the second standard deviation last week's VWAP, I think you have a good chance of breaking the high of the year and getting into 238. That being, let me just check my charts. Not our current prior week's third standard deviation of VWAP, but the week before that. It's around 240 or so. Above there, you have the yearly open from 2022. I imagine it would get tagged at some point. So that's what I'm looking for. Can we hold this area, this sort of mini balance? Can we hold it as support? Can we then close that stupid gap, get beyond the third standard deviation of last week's VWAP, and then take out that high of the year? That's what I'm looking like to the upside. To the downside, There's a lot of places this thing could stay bid. Maybe we go down to last week's third standard deviation to the downside. Maybe we close that gap at 278 and three quarters over here. I'm not really too sure. Maybe we tap the second half of the year's VWAP at triple twos right now. I don't know. This thing has a lot of spots to stay bid off of, so I'd be careful, chasing a short in the hole if we do run into a liquidation scenario. Last thing, news-wise, Chicago PMI, not a big one on Monday. Tuesday, ISM, I think manufacturing PMI jolts. Wednesday, non-farm employment change. Thursday, unemployment claims. ISM services PMI. Friday, the big one, NFP. Probably won't be trading that day. So in general, I know we're selling off right now, but in general, I don't really have a reason to be bearish. Hope that makes sense. Hope that helps. Going to be playing it day to day. Have a great night. Trade safe.